many people as possible during the discussion. And with that, I'll hand over to Marius Baumann. Marius, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Corbinian. It's a great honor and pleasure to welcome everybody to this year's Munich Lectures in Ethics. And I want to especially welcome our main speaker, Baroness Nora O'Neill, as well as our distinguished commentators, Stefan Gosepat, Lara Valentini, and Jeremy Waldron. We are very honored to have you with us for the coming days. But I also want to extend a very warm welcome to the many researchers and students from all over the world who are attending the lectures. One thing I think you didn't mention, Corbinian, the lectures are being recorded. You did all agree to this while registering. Just as another reminder, the lectures will be recorded. Okay, so as the academic director of the Munich Center for Ethics, I would like to use this opportunity to tell you just a little bit about our center, as well as the Munich lectures specifically, before the speaker of the center, Professor Monika Betzler, will introduce Baroness O'Neill and the commentators. So in non-pandemic times, we would now be meeting in the historic main building of Ludwig Maximilians Universität Munich, where the Ethics Center is located. Ludwig Maximilian University was founded in 1472. Interestingly enough, not in Munich itself, but in neighboring Ingolstadt. And it only came to be located in Munich a few centuries later. These days, LMU is one of the biggest universities in Germany with about 53,000 students. And it has been part of the German Universities Excellence Initiative since the start of that initiative. So the MCE itself, the Munich Center for Ethics itself, is an interfaculty research center at LMU. Our aim is to promote research and teaching on the topic of ethics and practical philosophy, broadly conceived. How do we do that? Let me just mention two of our tasks. For one, we are connecting researchers within the university as well as internationally. So for example, we are hosting visiting researchers who want to conduct their own research in Munich. So if you're interested in coming to Munich and do research in practical philosophy, you may reach out to us. For another, we are also taking part in teaching and educational duties at the university. And in this context, I want to just briefly mention our graduate school, Ethics in Practice. The grad school is, to our knowledge, one of the only grad schools that includes internships of up to a year, where our grad students do actual ethics in practice in a variety of public and private institutions. So these are just two of the things we do. But finally, we of course also have our own program of events at the center, academically as well as for the wider public. And this brings me to today's event, the Munich Lectures in Ethics. The Munich Lectures in Ethics are a biannual lecture series, which aims to address morally relevant challenges of our days and enhance our understanding of them. It is one of the stated goals of the lectures that it be accessible to listeners and later also readers, not only from philosophy, but also from a variety of adjacent fields. The Munich Lectures were inaugurated in 2019 with Philip Kitcher's lectures on moral progress, and they have since then quickly become one of the fixed points on our schedule. The lectures have been taken up for publication as a series by Oxford University Press. So Philip Kitcher's lectures, together with the comments by distinguished commentators Amir Srinivasan, Royal Yaki, and Susan Neiman, are due to be published shortly, co-edited by our speaker, Monika Betzler, as well as my predecessor at the center, Jan Heilinger. This year, finally, we are very, very fortunate and excited to be hosting the second lecture series given by Baroness Nora O'Neill on the topic, Why Human Rights Are Not Enough. And we have to say, as my colleague already mentioned, we are quite overwhelmed by the immense interest that the lectures generated. So I was just checking shortly before the lecture, and we had over 600 registrations from about 350 to 400 different universities. And we are especially delighted, given our goal of reaching a wide audience, that many people seem to be attending who are not from departments or not from the philosophy departments, from adjacent departments. So it's just marvelous to see how quickly this has turned into a truly international lecture series. We are, of course, aware that this is not all on us, but that this also has to do with the fact that the lectures are being held on Zoom. However, I'm certain that it also speaks to the reputation of our main speaker and of our distinguished commentators. And with this, I'm handing over to Professor Monika Betzler to introduce our main speaker and our distinguished commentators. Monika Betzler is the speaker of the Munich Center for Ethics, as well as holding the chair in ethical and practical philosophy at LMU, and currently serving as Vice Dean of the faculty. So Monika, please.
Thank you, Marius. I'm very honored to introduce Honora O'Neill, Baroness O'Neill of Mengarth, who graciously accepted our invitation to deliver the Munich Lectures in Ethics 2021. Baroness O'Neill is one of the most distinguished and prolific moral philosophers writing today. Her impressive body of work on ethics and bioethics, on political philosophy and the philosophy of Immanuel Kant proved to be immensely influential. She offered valuable insight into some of the most pressing issues of today, not only by her scholarly pursuits, but also by her political and public engagement. Honora O'Neill studied at Oxford University, tutored by Elizabeth Anscombe, and at Harvard University, where she completed a doctorate under the supervision of John Rawls. She then went on to teach at Barnard College of Columbia University and the University of Essex. In 1992, she took on the post of principal of Newnham College and as a professor of philosophy at Cambridge University. Honora O'Neill headed first the Nuffield Council on Bioethics and then the Nuffield Foundation, and is a former president of the British Academy. Moreover, from 2012 to 2016, she chaired the UK's Equality and Human Rights Commission. Since her appointment as a life peer in 1999, she serves as an independent crossbench member of the British House of Lords. Her seminal work in a variety of scholarly fields has been recognized with numerous accolades. She was awarded the Spinoza Chair, the Kant Prize, the Holberg Prize, as well as the Berggruen Prize, honorary doctorates from universities like Harvard University and the University of Bath, and here in Germany, the membership of the Leopoldina and the Order of Merit of the Federal Republic of Germany. Her scholarly work has been brought to a much wider audience by her 2002 BBC Reith Lectures entitled The Question of Trust, in which she argued that we should have a more careful and skeptical approach to rules and regulations that ask for more accountability and transparency. Furthermore, she has held several Gifford lectures on autonomy and trust in bioethics and on the ethics of communications. Apart from trust, Honora O'Neill has published extensively on, for instance, questions of bioethics pertaining to autonomy and informed consent, on Kantian ethics, on conceptions of justice, and on human rights. More recently, she also worked on practical judgment and normativity, on conceptions of public reason and autonomy, and on trust and accountability. Thank you so much, Professor O'Neill, for having agreed to deliver this year's Munich Lectures in Ethics on why human rights are not enough. Before we begin, and since our program on Thursday is quite dense, I take the liberty today to also introduce our three distinguished commentators. I will do so in alphabetical order and start with my colleague, Professor Stefan Gosepard. Having studied in Tübingen at the Free University Berlin and at Harvard University, Stefan Gosepard graduated with a doctorate from the Free University of Berlin, which he had pursued under the supervision of Ernst Tugendhat. Following visiting fellowships at Harvard, Columbia, and NYU, and professorships at the universities of Bremen and Gießen, he was a professor of international political theory and philosophy at the Goethe University in Frankfurt. In 2012, he accepted an appointment as professor of practical philosophy at the Free University in Berlin, his former alma mater. There, he is co-director of the Center for Advanced Studies, Justitia Amplificata, Rethinking Justice, Applied and Global, and principal investigator in various clusters of excellence and affiliated projects of the German Universities Excellence Initiative. His work engages with international criminal justice, solidarity in societies that are shaped by migration and normativity. Stefan Gosepard works predominantly on questions of global justice, equality, and human rights, as well as on theories of rationality, normativity, and reasons. Most recently, in 2021, he was the recipient of a prestigious Opus Magnum Fellowship of the Volkswagen Foundation for his newest project on the justice of inheritance. Thank you so much, Stefan, for having agreed to be with us tonight and this week. I also have the pleasure of presenting one of the newest members of our faculty at LMU Munich, my dear colleague, Professor Laura Valentini. Following studies in political science and political and legal theory at the University of Pavia in Italy, the University of Oxford, and the University College London, Laura Valentini was awarded a doctorate in political philosophy at UCL. She then went on to research positions at ANU, the Swedish Collegium for Advanced Study, the University of Uppsala, Princeton University Press, the University of Oxford, and Harvard University. From 2013, she held an associate professorship of political science at the London School of Economics before she took up an appointment as a chair in philosophy, politics, and economics at King's College in London in 2020. In January 2021, Laura Valentini then was appointed to the chair of philosophy and political theory at LMU Munich, and we're very happy to have her. In 2015, she was awarded a Philip Leverhulme Prize in Politics and International Relations for her work on duties of justice and humanitarian assistance, which enabled her to do further research on, for instance, the morality of socially constructed norms. A prolific scholar, Laura Valentini has published extensively in the fields of contemporary political, legal, and moral philosophy, including on questions of global justice, on freedom and human rights, political obligation, and the relation between moral philosophy and social ontology. Last, but in no way least, I'm delighted to present to you Professor Jeremy Waldron from New York University. After studies in philosophy and law at the University of Otago, upon which he was admitted as a barrister and a solicitor of the Supreme Court of New Zealand, Jeremy Waldron graduated with a doctoral in legal philosophy from the University of Oxford. In the following years, he taught at the University of Oxford, at the University of Edinburgh, at the University of California at Berkeley, at Princeton University, and at Columbia Law School, where he held the position of a university professor. In 2006, he was appointed a university professor and professor of law at NYU, which he held conjointly with his position as Chitchell Professor of Social and Political Theory at the University of Oxford from 2010 to 2014. Elected to the American Academy for Arts and Sciences in 1998 and a Fellow of the British Academy since 2011, Jeremy Waldron has given many prestigious academic lectures, most recently the Holmes Lectures at Harvard Law School on dignity and defamation, the Hamlin Law Lectures in England on the rule of law and the measure of property, and the Gifford Lectures in Edinburgh on equality. His prolific scholarly work includes seminal contributions on theories of rights, constitutionalism, the rule of law, democracy, property, torture, security, homelessness, and the philosophy of international law. Most recently, he published on questions as diverse as human rights, the basis of human equality, political institutions, dignity, rank, and rights, and the harm of hate speech. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm now opening the Munich Lectures in Ethics 2021 with Baroness Honora O'Neill and her distinguished commentators. I would also like to pass on a very warm welcome by our Dean of our Faculty of Philosophy, Theory of Science and Religious Studies, Professor Axel Hutter, and kindly ask you to join me in welcoming Professor Nora O'Neill to her first lecture today, Duties and Rights in the 20th Century. Let me remind you again that you can write questions already during the lectures in the Q&A section. Professor O'Neill, thank you again for having accepted our invitation. The virtual floor or screen is yours.
Thank you all so much. Those were very kind introductions and I appreciate it. This is an exciting occasion. I don't think I've done so large an occasion by Zoom yet. I'm audible, I hope. That's what one must always check, yes. But I think it works and we'll make it work. Now, the theme of human rights, as I look around my commentators, I think, well, some of them know a great deal more about human rights than I do. In particular, I think Jeremy Waldron knows a great deal more about human rights than I do. And I think perhaps the last occasion on which we met, that was one of the themes we were discussing. But it is, as it were, an overwhelmingly important and central theme in our day. You can't look at ethics without thinking, yes, that's where we talk about rights. Or is it just one of the places we talk about rights? Perhaps the lawyers would tell us that. Now, my intention is to try to describe how I think the focus that we have developed in the late 20th century and in our present century on rights, particularly on human rights, how that has changed our ethical outlook, because I think it has been quite a profound change. We all understand that ethics addresses, or is meant to address, practical questions. It asks questions about action, about what should be done and about what should not be done. But which sorts of questions and which sorts of answers? As we know, classical European approaches took the agent's perspective and addressed the question, what ought I do? Or what ought we do? And they offered accounts of human duties. So we are the heirs of a long tradition where the central focus was on the question of what action should be taken and not what could rightfully be claimed. How and why did we come to make the change? What have been the consequences of that change? Of course, when we dealt with theories of duties, this was not in any way a uniform view of ethics. Sometimes accounts of the sorts of duties that were important were developed in the context of an account of the good, sometimes by other methods without an overarching account of the good. But regardless of the metaphysics, or we might say with the 20th century, the metaethics, duty was absolutely central in ethical discussion. I would say from Cicero and the Christian Catechism up to certainly Immanuel Kant and Wordsworth's 1805 Ode to Duty. That ode to duty confidently equated duty with the voice of God. So let me give you two lines from Wordsworth which make this point rather emphatically. Stern daughter, the voice of God, O duty, if that name thou love, who art a light to guide, a rod to check the erring and reprove. And that may seem very stilted to us, but that was not merely not unconventional, it was exactly the sort of thing that you could assume everybody would understand when duty was the fundamental category. And duty was central to organizing claims about what justice required and claims about what virtue required. It was central to religion and to social life, to politics and to trade, to culture and to communication. Duty was, in short, ubiquitous. Now, given this historical perspective, I began to wonder a few years back, how and why did this focus on duty which for so long were seen as fundamental and indispensable, come to be challenged and in part, I emphasize only in part, to be relegated. And in this first lecture, I'm going to begin with a sketch. It's inevitably no more than a sketch of what happened. Then I shall try to say something about what was gained and what was lost by considering accounts of ethics in which duty is not seen as fundamental, and in particular, those which see rights rather than duties as fundamental. And finally, I shall try to ask slightly more focused questions about the further effects of that focus on rights, which, as we know, has become so widespread in the past century, so widespread that there are those who think that ethics is really about rights. Now, I'm not going to say a great deal, though inevitably I have to say a certain amount, about the justification of either ethical or epistemic norms or standards. And that isn't because I regard questions of justification as easy to answer, rather the contrary. It is because I think human rights claims are not self-evident and do require justification that I want for the moment to bracket that large set of very topical themes. I'm not persuaded by the mere fact that rights are ratified and proclaimed by states that this is an adequate justification, although there are plenty of people who think that the justification of human rights is that they have the backing of international bodies. However, these lectures focus on questions of structure rather than questions about the justification of normative claims, in particular ethical claims. I personally think justification matters, and I spent a lot of my life trying to say a bit about justification. And I have come to the view, I suppose, that justification is pretty closely connected to questions about structure. But on this occasion, I'm trying to keep justification off in the margins. Whether I shall succeed is another matter. So that's the theme of this first lecture, and it's also a theme that I will extend through into the other lectures. First, I have to begin with a bit of narrative. What on earth happened? Why did people come to think that rights were the fundamental ethical category, or at least one of the fundamental categories? In Europe, it had been so ancient to regard duty as fundamental, and there were very few dissenting voices until the 19th century. Nietzsche remarked, somewhat acidly, I think, "What destroys a man more quickly than to work, think, and feel without inner necessity, without any deep personal desire, without pleasure, as a mere automaton of duty?" I love that metaphor, automaton of duty. And another voice which we have to remember about Nietzsche, that he was supposedly ahead of his time. You might think not very much ahead of his time, given that soon after he wrote this, the centrality of duty to ethics began to be queried. So Nietzsche perhaps is, as in other matters, a harbinger. Despite many philosophical disagreements, duty was still central through much of the 19th century. But it began to change, in my view, very early in the 20th century, when subjective conceptions of the good that emphasized personal commitments and relationships came to be seen as important or more important. Despite its very austere title, the 1903 book by George Moore called Principia Ethica proposes a form of intuitionism that endorses a vision of ethics that centers on experiences of beauty, pleasure, friendship, knowledge, all those good things, but not on duty. However, in the event, of course, it wasn't the philosophers who made the change. They didn't dethrone duty. It was rather the tragedy of the First World War that did so, Until that war, duty had been seen by most people still as essential to ethics. And patriotic duty was held in particularly high regard. And I think this, by the way, is true both in the English and in the German speaking, and indeed in the entire, as we now say, Western world.
Well, Nora, may I just interrupt you quickly?
Yes.
I think several people are having problems to focus on the speaker view. So I would suggest that all the commentators and we are just turning off our videos now so that everyone can see you on full screen.
Okay.
I think that's better.
You still see Stefan, still see Jeremy. I'm waiting for
I think those are still,
Jeremy's.
I think those are still Stefan and Jeremy now. I think we're
okay, there we are.
Thank you very much.
Oh, those are stills, yes, they are. So, in the event, it wasn't the philosophers who dethroned duty, but rather the tragedy of that first war. And that changed everything. Once again, I think the poets probably led the way. I think of W.B. Yeats's wartime poem. It's very late in the First War. An Irish airman foresees his death. It contrasts views of patriotic duty with personal choice. Nor law, nor duty bade me fight, nor public men, nor cheering crowds, a lonely impulse of delight drove to this tumult in the clouds. Yeats wasn't alone. Enthusiasm for patriotic duty waned and often disappeared as the war proved more catastrophically brutal and destructive than had been imagined. Wilfred Owen, who's possibly the most famous of the World War I poets writing in English, who was killed a week before the end of the war, turned against patriotism. And he referred to Horace's famous line, dulce et decorum est pro patria mori, as the old lie. In the 20s, the novelist E.M. Forster expressed a view that was widely held when he wrote that if I had to choose between betraying my country and betraying my friend, I hope to God that I would have the guts to betray my country. Not something that one can easily imagine people saying a decade earlier. His comment combines rejection of patriotic duty with assertion of the importance of the personal and the subjective. And I think that switch to focusing on the personal and the subjective is of high importance. Between the wars, this continued, of course, though the best known philosophical rejection, not only of duty, but of a great deal more, as you all know, was that of the logical positivists. They did nothing by half measures, and they dismissed not only duty, but the whole of ethics, and plenty more, as, famous phrase, literally meaningless. If ethics was rejected, ethical standards could not be seen as objective or as justified, and there was no objective account to be had of what ought to be done. Now, claims that ethics is merely subjective or a matter of my values or my principles, or indeed my preferences, have become much more prominent. But this hardly offers a stable position. Subjective views of ethics appeal to each person's so-called values. I don't myself particularly like this phrase, i.e. to the principles that they happen to hold, and regards this as the supposed basis for ethics and for action. This conceit, because I think it is a conceit, was rather nicely lampooned. In the 1930s, it is said, though I cannot find the source, by Groucho Marx. Groucho Marx is said to have said, yes, I have principles, and if you don't like them, I have some others, which seems to me a wonderful, what shall I say, way of lampooning subjective views of ethics. Now, I don't expect that many of us now find the arguments of the logical positivists compelling, but I think that many of us would recognize the spread of views of ethics that center on individual experience and what individuals happen to value. it's become common to refer to whatever an individual likes or prefers as his or her values. It's more dignified, isn't it? Not just what I prefer, those are my values. And to offer them as a reason for, well, for whatever that person proposes to do. I sometimes wonder whether, if I mischievously told them that my values were self-enrichment and deforestation, why not? So I had reason to chop down and sell the trees, they would say, oh, if those are your values, you must go ahead. I somehow doubt that that would be the response. And yet this has happened. The thought that personal values and preferences could, indeed should, replace appeals to duty resonated very widely and led to questioning and criticism of ethical discussion that centered on duties. Now that, of course, is said without any reference to rights whatsoever. So let me now say something about why I think the dismissal of duty ended up with the affirmation of rights, because it's not obvious why that should happen. Subjectivist accounts of ethics, unsurprisingly, in my view, soon faced some quite distinctive problems. If we think about the horrors of the 1940s, we can understand why trying to do without some more robust account of ethics that includes an account of required action came to seem risky, and being insouciant about ethical standards or insisting that they are merely subjective appeared frivolously inadequate. Appealing to universal rights and treating rights rather than duties as anchoring claims about what ought to be done offered some sort of route back to taking at least some norms and standards seriously. So I think that the debates with which we're all familiar in the 1940s that led to the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and later, a little bit later, to the European Convention on Human Rights, are very understandable in the context of a world in which it has been alleged that duties don't particularly matter. More specifically, a focus on rights and thereby on standards that could, if the necessary legal and political structures were available, be enforced, could, it seemed, address the many dangers and insecure realities that people faced in the 1940s and indeed subsequent. After that short and, in my view, grim hiatus, many felt more than ready to reaffirm that ethical standards matter, and indeed that some of them need to be enforceable. Many of these standards were reformulated to prioritize the perspective of recipients or claimants rather than of agents. Human rights, as set out in those two great declarations of the 1940s, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the European Human Rights Convention, and subsequently in innumerable other international and national legal instruments, were increasingly taken as fundamental. Now, people felt this doesn't matter because, of course, it doesn't undermine the rest of ethics, and yet it's had, in my view, curious effects. It took some time, as a matter of fact, for the philosophers to catch up with the political world and to recover from the positivist eclipse of ethics. I'm very struck that Peter Laslett famously remarked in the very late 1940s that, I quote, "For the moment anyway, political philosophy is dead." An extraordinary thing to say. For the moment it's dead. Is it going to be resurrected? What's going to happen? Well, the fact is that the revival, as we now call it, of political philosophy, that revival which we associate with the names of John Rawls and Jürgen Habermas, still lay ahead, as did other efforts to repair the costs of the mid-century rejection of duty and turn to forms of subjectivism. And let's not congratulate our post-war selves. Many people have not rejected the subjective term. Since then, accounts of human rights, as formulated both in the Universal Declaration and in the European Convention have been central to a great deal of ethical and political discussion, not only among lawyers and legal theorists, but among philosophers and political scientists, and much more widely. And they've been incorporated into everyday discourse, into civic, commercial, and political life and institutions. This shift from focusing on duties to focusing on rights is in the first place a shift, indeed a reversal of perspectives, and I think that would be my fundamental view of it. Accounts of duties prioritize the perspective of agents. Accounts of rights prioritize the perspective of certain recipients, namely those who are entitled to claim others' action. And there's a great deal to be said for taking the claims and needs of recipients seriously. And so there are substantial reasons for taking rights seriously, and I wouldn't deny that in any way. But treating rights as the fundamental normative category for political and civic life and for legal argument has had a range of further and in some respects more troubling implications, and I'm going to discuss three of them this afternoon. The first one that I shall discuss is what happened to the duties. It's the obvious first question. Prioritizing rights, of course, does not get rid of the duties. On the contrary, if rights are to be claimed, the counterpart duties must be held by competent duty bearers, and duty bearers must be identifiable by those who seek to claim their rights. Yet in certain cases, it is, of course, hard to identify who are the relevant duty bearers. The problem's least difficult for rights whose counterpart duties fall on all others, so-called liberty rights, which require everyone to refrain from specified types of action. Examples include rights not to be tortured, rights not to be enslaved, rights not to be prevented from expressing one's views and opinions. If these are backed by competent and committed enforcers, such as a state with a legal order, adequate powers of enforcement, and a commitment to the relevant standards, well then, liberty rights can indeed be enforced. Unproblematic, and actually highly problematic in the detail, but unproblematic in principle. However, in other cases, prioritizing a focus on rights doesn't offer a clear way of identifying who holds the counterpart duties, nor therefore for establishing who ought to do what for who. Liberty rights are the easy case, not only because they require restraint rather than action, but because the counterpart duties fall on all others. So we don't have any problem in knowing who has the duties. A's right not to be tortured requires all others to observe counterpart duties not to torture her. B's right not to be prevented from expressing his views requires all others to respect counterpart duties not to silence him. This works provided that there is a competent and just enforcing body, typically a state. However, reliable ways of identifying who holds the counterpart duties that rights require aren't always available. A much discussed range of cases is that of so-called social and welfare rights, where institutional or political action is needed to create or to identify competent duty bearers before anyone can claim others' action as a matter of right. Indeed, the state's party to human rights instruments provide the necessary structures by enacting, so unless the state's party to human rights instruments provide the necessary structures by enacting legislation that identifies or indeed creates relevant duty bearers, these rights cannot be claimed. And that is, as it were, a debate that has been had at great length over some decades, and I'm not going to say much about it. But in some cases, the result has been a rather limited conception of certain rights. For example, the right to education, which was added in the 1952 protocol to the European Convention, is rather limited about what can be claimed, construing it as a prohibition on denying parental rights to educate. It reads, Article 2, right to education. No person shall be denied the right to education in the exercise of any functions which it assumes in relation to education and to teaching. The state shall respect the right of parents to ensure such education and teaching in conformity with their own, the right of parents to ensure such education and teaching in conformity with their own religious and philosophical convictions. One of the results of decades of discussion of this set of issues has been a long, but I think essentially unresolved standoff between those who maintain that human rights are supported by moral arguments and those who maintain that they are created by political decisions made and promoted by the state's party to leading human rights instruments. I think it's relatively easy for those who think that the justification of rights is in any case political to point to political action as making it possible to identify duty bearers, indeed to create duty bearers. But for those who see rights as requiring moral justification, it can be much harder to justify a specific allocation of duties that makes a reality of rights. And this debate has been particularly intense during the last decade. Let me give you a little sample of titles of books of the last decade, which seem to me to tell, just by the titles, a certain sort of story. The Samuel Moynes, The Last Utopia, Human Rights in History. Stephen Hopgood, The End Times of Human Rights. Eric Bosner, The Twilight of Human Rights. Noel Malcolm, Human Rights and Political Wrongs, A New Approach to Human Rights. Adam Ettinson, this is an anthology, a very good anthology, Human Rights, Moral or Political. And recently, Nigel Biggar, himself a theologian, Oxford, What's Wrong with Rights? Now, given that this is, so to speak, the dominant approach to questions of ethics of the public domain, I think it's striking what a note of anxious concern runs through the titles of these books of the last decade. So there's been a large amount of debate on these topics, and the issues aren't trivial. Unless those duty bearers can be identified or created and the necessary powers assigned, respect for rights will certainly be indeterminate and unenforceable. If human rights are political, the problem of identifying relevant duty bearers, both for liberty rights and for social and welfare rights, can in principle be solved. All that's needed, is for the powers that be to assign the duties to competent parties. But if human rights require moral justification, that's not enough. Reliance on state powers to identify duty bearers will also need justification. So that is one, if you like, very well established, but unresolved set of issues. And it's not the set of issues that I'm going to try to resolve in the next, this lecture and the next. Second problem I want to address this evening is the difference between perfect and imperfect duties. Venerable phrases, but I think often misunderstood. Traditional accounts of duty distinguished perfect, that just means complete duties, from imperfect, that is incomplete duties. Perfect duties had been discussed for centuries, long before human rights approaches were developed. Duties were labeled perfect, meaning that they were complete in the sense that they specified who should do what for whom. They were labeled imperfect when they were in some way incomplete or discretionary. And I think a good classical example of an imperfect duty is the duty of generosity. Of course we should be generous, but we can't, whatever we do, manage to be generous to everybody in every context, on all occasions, at all times. Generosity is inevitably discretionary, and so its generosity is an imperfect duty. Now, some, and this is perhaps the point I want to stress most, some but not all perfect duties which are not discretionary, identify both who is required to act and who may claim performance. Standard examples of perfect duties are those that require, for example, require us not to enslave others, or rights not to be tortured, have counterpart duties that are in no way discretionary, rights to receive a fair trial, rights not to be subjected to arbitrary arrest, detention, or exile. In these cases, we do not think of these duties as discretionary. In each case, duties to refrain from action that breaches these rights must be held by all others. Now, duties that have counterpart rights must be claimable, otherwise they wouldn't have counterpart rights. So they cannot be discretionary, so they must be perfect duties. But imperfect duties, by contrast, leave that degree of discretion over whether or not to act in a particular case. That's where generosity gives us the good example. Others' generosity can't be claimed as a matter of right, and the question of allocating generous action is left open perhaps to the agent. There are no rights to generous treatment, and claims to be treated generously are implausible. I'm not saying that we can set generosity aside. I do regard it as a very important matter, but we can see why it isn't a duty with a counterpart claim or right. Now, this, I think, reveals one of the significant implications of treating rights as fundamental. If rights are fundamental, we have to take claimable duties seriously. But we may, it seems, set aside what used to be classified as imperfect duties because they are discretionary. They're not claimable. Does that matter? Some commentators are relaxed about this. They see what used to be viewed as imperfect duties as because they are discretionary and not claimable, as interesting, maybe, but not required. Certainly not a matter of justice. They may think of imperfect duties as something which the fans of virtue ethics can very well occupy themselves with, but which political philosophy and legal philosophy, and more broadly the ethics of the public sphere, can simply ignore. I caricature, but I think you see the point. Starting from an account of rights unavoidably offers a narrowed account of what is required. Perhaps that doesn't matter. Perhaps accounts of human rights are meant only to cover enforceable requirements, and it's irrelevant that generosity and other imperfect duties, which are not a matter of right and not enforceable, are ignored. That's a matter for debate, but I don't think that's the end of this story about perfect duties. I think the real difficulty with prioritizing rights is that there are many traditional duties that are neither discretionary nor have counterpart rights, and that's what I want to focus on now. Traditional accounts of duty included many perfect, non-discretionary duties that could not be claimed by others as their due, so were not covered by theories of rights. This was, to say the least, awkward. If there had been only perfect duties with counterpart rights and imperfect duties without counterpart rights, things would have been clear-cut and relatively simple. But things are not so neat. Many older accounts also included perfect duties that cannot be claimed as a matter of right. Now, the fact that there can be perfect duties that do not have counterpart rights is quite often overlooked. For example, consider John Stuart Mill's discussion of perfect duties. Some people find it surprising that Mill still uses that classical distinction that he did. And he discusses perfect duties on the assumption that they always have counterpart rights. And thereby, in my view, he loses the distinction between two categories of perfect duty. Here's what Mill said. It's the last chapter of utilitarianism, but chapter 1 doesn't always reach. He wrote, "Now, it is known that ethical writers divide moral duties into two classes, denoted by the ill-chosen expressions, duties of perfect and of imperfect obligation." I think he thought that the phrase was ill-chosen because when you hear the word perfect in English, you think it is ideal, not that it is complete, but they're duties of complete and incomplete obligation. And he says, the latter being those in which the act is obligatory, but the particular occasions of performing it are left to our choice, as in the case of charity or beneficence, which we are indeed bound to practice, but not towards any definite person or at any prescribed time. And in the more precise language of philosophic jurists, duties of perfect obligations are those duties in virtue of which a correlative right resides in some person or persons. But duties of imperfect obligation are those moral obligations which do not give birth to any right. I think it will be found that this distinction exactly coincides with that which exists between justice and the other obligations of morality. And here I think Mill is wrong. I think he overlooked the difference between perfect duties that lack counterpart rights and imperfect duties. I may think, moreover, that it's very common to assume that there are just two things we have to attend to: perfect duties with counterpart rights and imperfect duties with no counterpart rights. And I think it's unfortunate. Examples of perfect duties without counterpart rights are difficult to spot. Standard examples might include some of the central duties of everyday life, such as honesty, trustworthiness, or reliability. They might also include perfect duties to oneself, such as duties not to commit suicide, duties to refrain from self-injuries, duties of self-respect. These were traditionally seen as perfect duties because they were not seen as discretionary. They were not seen as leaving agents discretion about whether or not to respect these requirements, let alone as permitting exceptions in the interests of inclination. Yet it would be absurd to see them as perfect duties whose performance anyone can claim as a matter of right. Well, perhaps somebody can work out what it would mean to make a claim against oneself, but I have to say I'm unconvinced. Another range of perfect duties without counterpart rights would include numerous epistemic duties that bear particularly on communication. Examples include duties of civility, duties to aim for accuracy, duties of attentiveness. These are not usually seen as duties whose performance others can claim as a matter of right, but nor are they generally seen as imperfect duties whose performance is wholly discretionary. My sense of the matter is that many epistemic duties are seen neither as discretionary imperfect duties, nor as duties whose performance can be claimed by holders of counterpart rights. And I also think that these epistemic duties have gained in importance with the use of digital technologies to communicate, and I'm going to turn to some more detailed discussion of that theme in the second lecture. Meanwhile, I simply note that the list of perfect duties that don't have counterpart rights may be very long. And you may say the list of perfect duties is quite long enough, thank you, but the number of perfect duties without rights is possibly even longer. The third problem to which I shall turn today is that of qualified duties, and this I will pick up again, particularly in the third lecture. And this is that any discussion of rights has to address the reality that rights may conflict, and that practical judgment is needed to determine which rights should be qualified in order to meet the claims of other duties and other rights that have weight in the same context. Few, if any, practical principles, including human rights claims, can be seen as unconditional requirements. In fact, I've asked myself while working on this topic whether any can be seen as unconditional requirements. I think it's probably implausible. Yet often the claims of one or more rights conflict. They cannot both be satisfied in a given situation. And this I have come to see as absolutely central to the philosophical discussion of human rights. It's not a question of justification, if you like, it is a question about implementation. Sometimes correct information should not be imparted to others in order to avoid a breach of trust. In other cases, it must be disclosed in order to avoid fraud. I'm sure that you can produce endless examples that have the same pattern. The indeterminacy of judgment, and specifically the indeterminacy of practical judgment, is a ubiquitous feature of practical reasoning. There are many norms and standards, and where it's not possible to satisfy them all, some must be qualified in order to respect others. And while human rights standards are widely seen as normative requirements that indeed rightly trump many others, they too must often be qualified. This is a central task of courts, including international courts, and in juridical contexts, it's often common to speak of balancing considerations or of seeking a proportionate resolution or decision. But despite the widespread use of these quantitative metaphors in discussions of judicial reasoning, there are no metrics for interpretation, nor therefore for judging which requirements or prohibitions should be qualified and which should be maintained in each case. In cases that are considered by courts, we say, but if you like, it's just glossing the surface, that legal experience and judicial reasoning work within a framework of requirements and precedents and carry what is standardly referred to as the burden of judgment. However, most practical judgments are not made in courts. They're made without resort to legal process. And since practical judgment is ubiquitous and indispensable in daily life, it isn't really much consolation to say that where it happens in a court, there is an authority that is charged with determining how one right shall qualify another. Complex situations and potential conflicts between multiple rights and multiple duties mean that it's very often necessary to qualify one requirement in order to meet another. And that, in a sense, is the problem that I'm trying to get a handle on. This evening, I merely tried to identify some of the wider implications of moving from taking duties to taking rights as fundamental. My preliminary conclusion is that according priority to rights rather than to duties has had, and it continues to have, profound implications for ethics, because rights are blind not only, as everybody agrees, to imperfect duties, which are discretionary, but also to perfect duties without counterpart rights. Substituting the recipient for the agent perspective leaves us with a handle on a range of ethical standards that have long been thought important. Once the classical agent's question, what ought I do, or what ought we do, was replaced with versions of the recipient's question, what are my rights, or much more crudely, what am I entitled to, or what ought I get? Duties without counterpart rights were marginalized and likely to be overlooked. Treating rights rather than duties as fundamental has consequently, in my view, led to a narrowed view of ethical requirements. Now that is merely setting up a problem, but that is where I shall end this lecture. And I think that the more one reflects on the consequence of this profound shift from taking the agent's question as fundamental to ethics to taking a recipient's question as fundamental, the more one can see what a deep effect it has had and how difficult it is to resolve. In the next lecture, however, I'm going to some extent to divert in order to expand the examples of the range of things that arise when one does this shift from the agent to the recipient perspective in the area of the ethics of communication. I believe the effects have been particularly profound there, and perhaps any of you who have followed some of the claims that have been made about rights to freedom of expression in the latter days of the Trump administration will immediately see what I'm concerned about there. That is where I shall stop for this evening. I look forward to discussion.
Thank you very, very much.